In the dark, restless waters of the Pacific in 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy believed it owned the night. Their cruisers and destroyers moved with confidence across the Solomon Islands, slipping through the shadows to reinforce their isolated garrisons. Japanese commanders were certain that no American vessel could stalk them after sunset. To them, the ocean at night was a shield, one they had mastered over decades of naval doctrine built on stealth, discipline, and well-trained night optics. But this growing confidence would soon be shattered by something they never expected: small, fast, aggressive American PT boats that attacked like packs of wolves, striking without warning and disappearing before the Japanese could react. These lightweight wooden boats, powered by massive aircraft engines, would become one of the most feared American weapons in the shallow waters of the Pacific. And for Japanese sailors, the terror of facing these boats was something entirely new. This fear didn't come from their size. They were tiny compared to destroyers. It didn't come from heavy armor. They had none. And it didn't come from overwhelming firepower, because compared to battleships, they barely carried enough guns to be called warships. The fear came from their unpredictability, their speed, and the psychological shock of being hunted at night by something they could hear but not see, by something they fired at but rarely hit. Before the Pacific War, few Americans knew what a patrol torpedo boat actually was. These small vessels, usually 70 to 80 feet long, were barely larger than commercial fishing boats. Built mostly from plywood, they were considered expendable. They were never meant to challenge heavy ships head-on. Instead, they were designed to strike from the shadows, fast, stealthy, and lethal. And in 1942, as the United States struggled to hold the line in the Pacific, these boats were thrust into some of the most dangerous waters on Earth. The story begins in the early months of the Pacific War. Japan had conquered territories stretching thousands of miles. American bases were destroyed, ships sunk, and morale shaken. The U.S. Navy desperately needed a weapon that could operate in narrow passages, shallow lagoons, and coral-filled channels where larger ships could not survive. That weapon became the PT boat. Early deployment of PT boats in the Philippines had already shown their potential. In January 1942, PT-41 helped General Douglas MacArthur escape the collapsing front on Bataan, racing through the night under Japanese air patrols. MacArthur himself would later praise the PT boats for their speed, courage, and surprising resilience. But the true test of these boats came later at Guadalcanal, the pivotal island that changed the course of the Pacific War. By mid-1942, the Japanese were running supply convoys, nicknamed Tokyo Express, through the Slot, a narrow sea channel filled with reefs, rainstorms, and darkness. The American Navy's large ships struggled to intercept these convoys due to poor night visibility and the superior Japanese night fighting skills. This is where the PT boats became essential. During the Guadalcanal campaign, American PT boats were deployed from Tulagi and other small bases. Their mission was simple: disrupt Japanese supply lines by attacking destroyers, barges, and troop transports at night. Japanese night operations had always been strong, but they suddenly found themselves facing a new kind of enemy, one that appeared suddenly, fired torpedoes at point-blank range, and vanished into the blackness like smoke. Japanese sailors were stunned the first time they encountered PT boats. Destroyer crews described seeing mysterious wakes in the darkness. Officers believed American motorboats were too slow and too fragile to matter. But when the first torpedo slammed into a Japanese transport, blowing it apart, the disbelief turned into shock. A PT boat attack was unlike anything the Japanese had seen. At night, the engines of a PT boat produced a terrifying roar, but their small profile made them almost impossible to spot visually. Japanese gunners fired blindly into the dark, while the torpedo crews waited for the moment of impact or escape. Many Japanese accounts mention the same detail: a sudden engine scream, a flash of muzzle fire, and then the horror of a torpedo streaking toward them. In many cases, the PT boats escaped unharmed, zigzagging across the water at high speeds. Their light wooden hulls made them surprisingly resilient. Shells often punched holes straight through without detonating, giving the boats time to withdraw before sinking. Japanese crews were confused. How could such fragile boats survive direct gunfire? How could they keep coming back night after night? Their fear became even more pronounced in 1943 and 1944, as PT boats began attacking not just destroyers, but also the small landing barges Japan used for supply runs. The Japanese thought their barges would be too small and maneuverable to be hit, but PT boats closed in extremely fast, firing cannons at close range and using their speed to outrun any counterattack. Japanese soldiers who survived these raids described the terror of the boat's approach. An engine roar in the darkness followed by sudden explosions and tracer fire. The Japanese were especially shocked by the discipline and aggression of the American PT crews. Many were young, often in their early 20s, but they fought with a mix of improvisation and boldness that confused seasoned Japanese officers. The famous PT boat bases, such as the ones on Rendova and Buka Passage, became symbols of American daring. One of the most symbolic moments came with future President John F. Kennedy, commander of PT-109. In 1943, during a nighttime patrol, his boat was rammed by a Japanese destroyer. Although PT-109 was torn in half, Kennedy and his crew survived, swimming for miles and evading capture. The Japanese destroyer captain later expressed disbelief that anyone could survive such an incident. The story became legendary, reinforcing the idea that PT boats were manned by crews who simply refused to quit. By 1944, the effectiveness of PT boats forced Japanese commanders to modify their night strategies. Convoys moved faster, changed routes frequently, and reduced the use of destroyers for transport. They also began reinforcing barges with armor plates to withstand PT gunfire. But despite these efforts, PT boats continued to inflict losses, both physical and psychological. One overlooked factor was the noise. Japanese sailors often wrote about the haunting sound of PT boats at full throttle. Unlike the deep rumble of destroyers, PT boats produced a sharp, high-pitched roar due to their aircraft-derived engines. The sound echoed across lagoons and bays, giving Japanese troops only seconds to react. Many remembered lying awake at night, listening to distant engines, knowing an attack might be moments away. The fear was not only from the boats themselves, but from what they symbolized: American determination. Even in the darkest waters, the U.S. Navy was willing to engage the Japanese up close, at high risk, with small wooden boats that relied entirely on courage, speed, and surprise. As the war progressed, PT boats spread across the Philippines, New Guinea, and Borneo, raiding Japanese coastal positions, ambushing troop transports, and escorting American landing craft. Their success contributed significantly to the collapse of Japanese logistics. Without constant supplies, isolated Japanese garrisons starved, surrendered, or were wiped out by larger American operations. By 1945, PT boats had become infamous among Japanese sailors. Even though Japanese commanders tried to dismiss them as minor threats, many frontline troops disagreed. To them, these boats represented a relentless, unpredictable enemy, small but deadly, fragile but fearless. In the end, the Japanese fear of PT boats came from their inability to counter them effectively. They were too fast to hit, too maneuverable to trap, and too aggressive to intimidate. The terror of these nighttime attacks became part of Japan's wartime memory. And although PT boats were never the largest, strongest, or most advanced vessels in the U.S. Navy, they had a psychological impact far beyond their size. They broke Japan's confidence in night dominance and proved that American ingenuity and courage could overcome even the strongest naval traditions. This transformation, from Japanese control of the night to fear of America's small, fast PT boats, was one of the most unexpected shifts in the Pacific War, reshaping the balance of power in the Solomons, the Philippines, and beyond. And that fear would only grow stronger as the war continued. As the night deepened across the Pacific, Japanese convoys moving between island outposts believed the darkness to be their greatest shield. They were convinced that no American vessel could breach the vast black ocean undetected, especially not something as small and fragile as the American patrol torpedo boats, better known as PT boats. But this confidence would soon turn into fear because the Americans were not approaching with massive battleships or aircraft carriers. They were coming with shadows, fast, quiet, and armed with torpedoes capable of ripping open a destroyer. Japanese sailors began to whisper stories. Some claimed they had seen streaks of white foam racing across the water before explosions tore through their ships. Others swore they had heard powerful American engines only seconds before impact. Many had no warning at all. The small, wooden PT boats moved so quickly that even trained lookouts could not detect them until it was too late. One of Japan's greatest concerns was the fact that PT boats rarely traveled alone. They appeared in groups, packs that hunted like wolves. They approached under the cover of rough seas, unexpected wind, or complete moonless nights. And because they were so light, the waves that slowed larger warships actually worked in their favor. Their hulls rose and fell rapidly, allowing them to dart through conditions that other ships avoided. Japanese commanders were forced to admit the Americans had introduced a craft that did not follow traditional naval rules. The sailors stationed on lightly armed barges felt this terror more than anyone. Their missions often required transporting troops, ammunition, and food between islands. These barges had minimal armament and could barely reach speeds fast enough to outrun the current, let alone escape an American PT boat. In many cases, Japanese barge crews would only hear distant engines, followed by flashes of tracers cutting through the night. Panic often broke out as crew members scrambled to find cover behind fuel drums or cargo crates, knowing they had no chance of returning fire effectively. American PT boat crews were trained specifically for these nighttime ambushes. They practiced turning off all lights, lowering their silhouette, and cutting the engines at the perfect moment to drift silently into firing position. This tactic was terrifying to the Japanese because it made the boats seem invisible. Lookouts would stare into the dark horizon, see nothing, and then suddenly, a torpedo wake would be speeding toward them. The psychological effect was enormous. In many Japanese after-action reports, officers wrote that they felt they were being attacked by ghost ships. This description wasn't just dramatic wording. Many genuinely believed the Americans had developed new technology that allowed their boats to vanish. The truth was simpler. PT boats were built for night. Their entire strategy relied on being unseen until the very last second. Japanese soldiers being transported across channels were constantly on edge. Some refused to sleep during night crossings. Others developed rituals, touching lucky charms, whispering prayers, or keeping one hand on their rifle at all times. Even though they knew a rifle was useless against a fast-moving torpedo boat, the fear was instinctive. It felt wrong to cross open water when an enemy could appear at any moment. Reports from the Solomon Islands campaign reveal that some Japanese officers preferred delaying barge movements for days rather than risk traveling during nights of low moonlight. They believed those specific conditions were when PT boats were the most deadly. American commanders knew this and waited patiently, turning the darkness into their own form of territory they fully controlled. The Japanese Navy tried several strategies to counter PT boats. They attempted increasing the number of convoy escorts, but these ships were large and slow to maneuver. PT boats simply targeted from angles the escorts could not cover. They tried launching aircraft at night, but visibility made spotting small wooden boats nearly impossible. They attempted deploying searchlights, but turning on a light in the middle of a dark ocean only made the barge a clearer target. Eventually, the Japanese began installing extra machine guns on their barges, but these weapons were manually operated and required lookouts to first identify the incoming PT boat. Most attacks happened too quickly. The Americans would blast in, fire their torpedoes or machine guns, and disappear into the night long before the Japanese could coordinate a response. Some Japanese diaries describe how soldiers could barely see the shape of the PT boat. All they ever caught was the outline of a speeding silhouette against the faintest glow of the sea. Moments later came the sound, deafening engines powered by 3 massive gasoline motors. The roar was startling because it happened so suddenly, but by the time soldiers heard it, the attack was already underway. The psychological toll on Japanese forces became so severe that even rumors spread rapidly. Some claimed PT boats could climb over coral reefs. Others said the Americans had developed torpedoes that could turn mid-water. None of this was true, of course, but fear thrives in darkness. When you combine panic with poor visibility, imagination becomes a weapon by itself. What truly terrified Japanese commanders, however, was the efficiency of the American crews. PT boat crews were disciplined, cohesive, and largely composed of volunteers who preferred fast-moving, high-risk missions. Their confidence radiated in their performance. They respected the danger, but embraced it. Some Japanese officers wrote that these crews fought with the recklessness of men who believed they would win every fight. In a conflict where the Japanese Navy had once dominated the Pacific, facing these small, aggressive, and unpredictable American boats was humiliating. Japan's naval doctrine was built around large ships, heavy weapons, and long-range engagements. PT boats shattered those expectations. They forced the Japanese to fight a different type of war, one where shadows were more deadly than battleships. Throughout 1943 and 1944, the Americans intensified their nighttime operations. PT boats routinely intercepted Japanese barges carrying reinforcements and supplies. This had a devastating effect on Japanese island garrisons. Some units became isolated and were forced to ration food or go hungry for weeks. Military planners in Tokyo struggled to find a reliable method of resupplying their troops without exposing them to nighttime attacks. The Japanese Navy attempted using armored barges to withstand PT boat fire. While stronger, these barges were much heavier and slower. PT boats easily outmaneuvered them and simply attacked from angles where armor was weakest. The Japanese then tried transporting supplies during heavy storms, believing rough seas would deter the Americans. But PT boats continued to operate even in poor weather, surprising Japanese sailors who expected the attacks to stop. American intelligence also played a major role. Through intercepted communications, the U.S. Navy often knew which routes Japanese barges would take. PT boats positioned themselves accordingly, blocking key channels and waiting for their targets. Some Japanese soldiers wrote that it felt like the Americans could read their minds. By 1944, the fear of PT boats became so widespread that entire Japanese positions were abandoned because supply routes were considered too dangerous. Some soldiers were left stranded for months, unable to receive ammunition or reinforcements. This isolation contributed directly to several Japanese defeats. Even after the war, Japanese veterans admitted that the small American PT boats were among the most disruptive threats they faced. Not because of their size, but because of how they were used. The Americans leveraged mobility, surprise, and deep understanding of naval geography. They mastered the art of night warfare and turned the darkness into a strategic advantage. American commanders admired the courage of their PT boat crews. Many missions required approaching enemy positions dangerously close, navigating reefs, or dodging artillery fire. These crews were not only skilled, but deeply committed to stopping the Japanese war machine, no matter how risky the assignment. Their success was not accidental. It was earned through relentless training and fearless execution. The Japanese also understood that PT boats symbolized something bigger. They represented America's ability to innovate quickly, adapt to changing battlefield conditions, and apply pressure in unexpected ways. PT boats were relatively cheap to build, yet they created disproportionate damage. They became proof that technology alone doesn't win wars. Strategy and adaptability do. As the war progressed and Japan's naval resources diminished, PT boats became an even greater threat. With fewer warships to patrol the ocean, Japanese barges were left exposed. PT boat crews exploited this vulnerability ruthlessly. They knew that controlling the sea lanes at night meant controlling the flow of the war itself. And they succeeded. Even today, the legacy of PT boats remains strong in military history. They demonstrated how small, fast units can disrupt larger forces. They showed how fear can become a weapon, and how the right tactics can shift the momentum of an entire campaign. For the Japanese soldiers who lived through those terrifying nights, the sound of an approaching PT boat was something they would never forget. The Americans proved that size does not determine strength. It is the will to strike, the creativity to adapt, and the discipline to operate under extreme conditions that define victory. And during many nights in the Pacific, it was the roar of PT boat engines and the explosions that followed that reminded the Japanese Empire just how vulnerable they truly were.